It's Thursday morning. It's Rachna here. I'm the CEO at the Graduate Students Association at the University of Melbourne. As many of you have been listening to our Thursday session, where we've been very fortunate to get different faculties and different departments of the University of Melbourne and other organizations to come and speak to us on a Thursday morning. And today we are very fortunate to have Professor Steve Trumble, who is the head of the Department of Medical Education, joining us. So before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm meeting in the land of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation in this virtual environment. I'd like to also pay my respects to the past, present, and emerging leaders, and the respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So thank you so much, Steve, for joining us. And I would like to just introduce him. I have a short bio that I'd like to read, and following that we have, it's a discussion. We do have people who would be joining us, who joined us today to talk to Steve. And I think it's a great opportunity to acknowledge that we are going through a very difficult time all over the world in COVID, during the COVID-19. Our experience at GSA is that we acknowledge that graduates and all students have had to face many challenges. It's also been very important for us to acknowledge that the University of Melbourne's faculties have tried their very best to adapt to the quick change, address concerns of students, and this session is basically an opportunity to improve the communication between the faculties and the schools to the students, an opportunity to raise your concerns and for the school to provide you information. So Professor Steve Trumble is the head of the Department of Medical Education, a role that includes coordinating the Melbourne Medical School's Doctor of Medicine program. As a general practitioner by training, Steve began his academic career developing teaching, research, and clinical services in the field of developmental disability medicine before taking up a leadership role in the vocational training and now entry to practice medical education. He established the Melbourne's Medical School Excite, which is Excellence in Clinical Training, a teaching program that provides awards courses for clinicians who teach. So he's involved in the research across the spectrum of education for the health professionals. And we were delighted just with one email, and you're having a very busy schedule, that Steve was very kind enough to join us this morning. Good morning, Steve, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Rachna. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I probably thought it would be good for us to hear a little bit from you about what life has been for you during this period of COVID-19. I'm sure a very, very busy schedule, long hours, lots of conversations. So what kind of support have you been thinking, has your school been thinking of and doing for the students during this current period?
Well, I know it sounds trite and everybody says it, but it has been an extraordinary few months for students and staff. And I mean, the whole world has turned upside down. It needs to be acknowledged, I guess, that the Australian situation has been a very different one to that being experienced by other countries around the world, and that you wouldn't have thought this time last year we'd be in a situation where public health and epidemiologists were basically the heroes of the piece in terms of their advice to government about restrictions on travel and things like that, that actually given Australia such a relatively safe experience of the COVID pandemic to this point. It has obviously had a huge impact on the university and on students in particular, though. So, our role, I guess, in the medical school has been to try to keep students moving forward in their education in the most appropriate way possible, while recognising that the pandemic has hit all aspects of their life and impacted on well-being and family separations and family health and things like that. So it's certainly been a very steep learning curve for everybody. And as I say, I wouldn't have thought that 2 weeks ago I'd be sitting in my tracksuit pants down in our house at Aries Inlet, basically trying to run the medical course from here. But with goodwill on the part of students and staff, it's actually working surprisingly well. I'm conscious that the focus is on student support, and I think that's really very, very important. I am also conscious that there could be some people listening who are not medical students in the medical course, but otherwise involved in MDHS. It's a massive faculty. It's got a lot of programs, a lot of health professional courses, undergraduate courses as well, of course, and also research high degree students and other master's degrees and those sorts of things. So support would have to be different for each of those. I need to apologise, I guess, and say that my focus is very much on the medical course because that's my main responsibility. But I do think there's some interesting points to talk about how we've had to respond to the pandemic and how the students have worked with us to keep progressing through the course in as best way as they can. There's a few more things to say there, I guess, now that you've got me started. The medical course is a bit unique, I suppose, in that it takes students a while to figure this out when they apply, but 3/4 of the course is spent away from the Parkville campus. This has always been an issue that, you know, a medical student spends the last 3 years of the 4-year course in their clinical school. So they're based in the hospitals around Melbourne and around Victoria, and they also spend time in general practices. So a lot of centrally provided services based at Parkville just don't reach the students who are out in their clinical schools. It's not to say that they're not supported in their clinical schools. In fact, it's actually one of the greatest strengths of Melbourne Medical School is its clinical school structure. It breaks down a big cohort of 350 students into smaller groups of 48 or 64 students per year level per clinical school. And that's where a lot of the sort of day-to-day support and encouragement and problem solving occurs. Obviously, shifting online has made that more difficult. You don't get the chats in the common room and the catching up on ward rounds and those sorts of things. One other issue I wanted to mention is that for a number of years, the medical school has had student health and wellbeing practitioners because of this issue of most of our students being off the Parkville campus. So those student health and wellbeing practitioners, there's 3 of them scattered around the state and one in Melbourne. Have been providing support to students over a number of years beyond what's provided through the Central University Counselling Services. But one point that I'm a bit concerned about is it's been reported to me that they're not seeing the everyday student concerns coming up. This is something that my colleagues in general practice are also reporting, that because of the overwhelming nature of the pandemic and its impact on our lives, people aren't coming forward with the day-to-day concerns. So they're either not being addressed at all, they're being stored up for the future, or people are dealing with them as best they can. But I think what we might see is quite a surge of unmet need for student support once we start getting more mobile.
Right. And I think it's, I think you've picked up the point really well. I think, students have the greatest appreciation for the University of Melbourne's medical school because it has that practical placement and the clinical placement, and then they find themselves in this unique world because of the changes that have happened due to COVID-19. So are there any specific policies or, can you comment a little bit about what your thoughts are about when or how you plan to open the clinical placements?
Yeah, look, that's been really interesting. And as I say, the Australian experience and New Zealand has been pretty unique in the world. When the virus was on the increase, the fear internationally was that the hospitals were going to get overrun with cases and that the number of intensive care beds, the capacity would not be there to support the number of people who would need them. And that's certainly been the case in countries with sort of substandard health systems like I'm thinking the Philippines, the United States of America, places like that, where basically people have just been dying because of the inability to receive that high-level care. So everything heading into the pandemic was about getting the hospitals prepared for that sort of surge. Unfortunately, one casualty of that was medical student placements, because this has been one great problem for medical education over the generations, is that medical students are not seen as essential members of the healthcare team. Not in the same way that nursing students are, who do an enormous amount of work during their clinical placements, and physio students and social work. All the other disciplines who have clinical placements generally are able to contribute to workforce while they're having those placements. Medical students, not so much. We tend to be more observers, particularly in the early part of the course. So the big problem was we were expecting the hospitals to get overwhelmed. What actually turned out was quite the opposite. And this is a hell of a good problem to have, but there just wasn't the amount of work being done for there to be adequate placements for students. All the elective surgery was shut down, outpatient clinics were closed, wards were closed or made off limits to students because of the vulnerability of the patients in there and the fear of students bringing in the virus through community transmission. So we sort of ended up with a situation of the hospitals being fully prepped for an onslaught of seriously ill people, not doing any of the routine clinical work, which is bread and butter for medical students, and placements just collapsing. So yes, we did have to suspend placements for a period of time because there wasn't any work to do, and physical distancing meant that putting students into that mix was inappropriate. We're very lucky in Melbourne, and I would be fibbing to say that it wasn't really luck, but our most senior students, those in the final year of the course, aren't meant to be in the hospitals at the moment anyway. They're doing a research semester. So whereas other universities around Australia had to keep their most senior students in the hospitals, largely twiddling their thumbs, our students have been very busy doing their standard research work, and then they will return to placement in 10 days' time. That's when the first group goes back. The full capacity is not there. That's actually 8 weeks earlier than what we would usually do, because, and you know, this is a major concern, there is every possibility this virus is going to surge again, or even worse than it did or didn't do the first time. So everything we're doing is about trying to keep the students moving towards graduation, even if things go pear-shaped again, which obviously we hope they don't. So that is meaning that as soon as the opportunity is there, which is the 1st of June, our most senior students start to go back in a staggered nature in order to prepare for becoming interns working in the hospitals from January. Because the capacity is not complete, not everybody could start at the same time. It also is impacting on the finishing off of their research work. So we've had to call for volunteers for students to be back in that first group. We've had to actually then move to being fairly definite with students, pointing out that, you know, if they can get back, it would be good to get back, for fear that the placements are going to collapse again, which we obviously hope they don't. So that's been the big thing about getting the most senior students back into clinical placement so they can rehearse the role of being interns and become competent doctors by the usual time in November, or sorry, late October actually is when they finish up. Because we don't want to bump things back into the summer break, because they need to be fully prepared and rested to start work as interns on the 11th of January.
Yeah, that's a very close timeline. A very close timeline, isn't it?
Well, it is. There's not a lot of room. I mean, it's interesting. If you move things back by even a week, it becomes too late for students to graduate. But what will graduation ceremonies look like? That's the thing. I mean, there are also the timelines for getting students registered with the medical board. They have their own timelines. So it's very tight. But what we have been able to do, and actually one thing I'm really very excited about, I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, is that all the medical schools around Australia have collaborated on figuring out what it is a medical student actually needs to know before they graduate. Yeah. It seems extraordinary. It took a little twist of RNA to push us into doing work that should have been done a long time ago to define the core competencies of a medical course that you need to be able to see a student doing before you can say, yep, you're ready to go off and be a doctor.
Okay, one of the things, I mean, I guess, being the head of the school, you kind of hear, and I'm sure you hear it more than us, about the anxieties of, how am I going to make up for the lost time? And, how would I lose some skills because I haven't done my placement or I haven't had face-to-face lectures? What would your communication to be, not only to the final year students, but to the students of the medical school?
Yeah, well, one of the first things we've noticed is that I don't think we'll ever go back to the large group face-to-face lectures. I mean, we've been trying to move away from those for a long time because they're not a good way to educate, to be perfectly frank. Moving to a more online platform, the engagement of students has been fantastic. There've really been many more questions, many more thoughtful questions, questions that are upvoted to make sure that you respond to the most important ones. The convenience of a clinical teacher being able to jump on Zoom and to give an hour's update on some clinical point of medicine and then go off again. Okay, it's not perfect by any means, but in some ways we've noticed that there's been a huge improvement in the accessibility and consistency of the teaching delivery, particularly across such a complex environment as our scattered clinical schools. So that side of it's been really good. However, you really can't learn medicine from computer. You've got to learn it from patients and get used to talking to patients and taking histories and things like that. Now, again, I had 2 hours yesterday doing virtual interactions on Zoom, and it works really well. As a teacher, I actually found the engagement better, role-playing and rehearsing patient interactions using Zoom than even in a tutorial room. So a lot of that stuff we're keeping up to date with. The other thing is assessment. Now, students hate assessment, there's no question about that. It also is the thing that tends to shape their learning behaviours more than anything else. We had to be very clear early on that we needed to keep assessing students so that they know that they're continuing to progress and that we know they're continuing to progress. It's not unique to medical courses, but it's obviously very evident in medical courses that it's not just between the student and the university assessments. There's a third stakeholder involved, and that is, of course, the public. The public needs to be confident that their junior doctors are being graduated with the necessary skills and they've kept up to speed. So this is why all the universities came together to figure out what it is a student needs to know. And that is what assessments are focused on. So that when we give our students assessments, we hope they'll feel confident that if they've passed that assessment, it means they are ready to move forward to the next step. It has led to us needing to do some fairly hefty work on academic integrity. And academic integrity is an interesting concept. It is actually more about the exam than about the student. It's about our ability to deliver exams remotely online that we know are secure, because the various databases that we draw our assessment items from need a guarantee that the assessment items will remain secure because they're high stakes. I mean, a student who cheats in a medical exam is obviously risking patient safety if they are inappropriately advanced in the course when they didn't know the content. So we take that very, very seriously. It has led to some concerns for students, which I can understand, that we have to use remote proctoring software in order for the various accreditation bodies to be confident that our exams are worth accrediting. And that does mean students being observed by bot to make sure that they're not cheating during the exam. The thing that's probably caused the most concern is toilet breaks, which is something I hadn't really anticipated, but which I can fully understand. And even just yesterday, we had to come to an agreement that keeping a student sitting in front of a computer for 3 hours during an exam and not being able to take a break without it triggering a need to investigate why the student disappeared from view means that we've had to reshape the exams to be within a much more reasonable bladder capacity. So to me, that's a logical, biologically driven policy, which is making sure that we've got reliable exams while not actually making students unnecessarily uncomfortable.
I think that's good to hear, Steve, because, I absolutely appreciate students raising the concern, but I think this is also a good platform for GSA to let the students know that, different schools have listened to feedback and they're reviewing policies and, they're addressing concerns, because I think often it's important for graduates and students to know that we never had a 101 plan book about how to address this pandemic, and that the aim of GSA is to keep this communication and dialogue happening during this very difficult and concerning time for everyone around. And I think the purpose of our grad chat is that. So thank you for addressing that. There's also sometimes students, majority of the students were very happy with the changes that were made to WAM. But is there any comment that you would want to, because some students have informed us that WAM changes may not apply to the medical course and conveyed in some worries. Is that you're hearing, or it may impact the future of their studies or career plans? Is there any comment you'd like to provide on that?
Yeah, look, this has been really interesting that, having just talked about the reliability of assessments, then you need to be confident that the marks produced by the assessments are also reliable. It has been problematic, I guess, that I can fully understand the university's perspective that you give the student the benefit of the doubt, or they play the advantage, I guess, if there is an exam that you feel if you exclude its score, you get a overall better WAM, or if you include its score, you get an overall better WAM. And it sort of goes back to the previous concept about when it's really just between the student and the university. To be honest, it doesn't much matter. If it means you can select the assessments that give you the best possible score, all fair enough. Where it gets a bit more difficult is when people are being ranked for employment. And this is a big issue. And the actual meeting I was on before was continuing to try to resolve our state government's obsession with our graduates' rankings, because that's how they, it's a large part of how they then award jobs for internships. And this is hugely problematic, because if a student is lucky enough to have had a certain learning experience that advantages them for an exam, and another one hasn't been as lucky because their clinical school was unable to provide that particular piece of learning in the same way, it means that the rankings become more about who's been lucky rather than about who's genuinely got the best academic performance. So this has also led to a decision not to include the scores from this semester in applications to the medical course. This is something that nearly every medical school in Australia feels the same way about, that it becomes a question of luck rather than ability when you're able to juggle your scores from this semester in order to influence your WAM. So the decision was taken by all Australian medical schools except two that we would have to ignore the scores from this semester for people producing their GPA for selection into the medical course. In the same way, we're uncomfortable about using scores from this semester for ranking students in the graduation list. It really only has an impact on who gets honours and who doesn't in that way, which is probably not the end of the world, although I can fully understand students' frustration at not being able to juggle things around to get the best possible score they can. The other thing that makes it more difficult is most of our subjects are year long. They're not semesterized. So the subjects that students are currently in years 2 and 3 run for the whole year. So there's no discrete marking that occurs within the bounds of this current semester. So it's difficult. There are a number of things that are central university policies that cause some concern for the medical schools, such as statements that the whole course will be delivered online. Well, okay, we'll do as much as we can online, but there does come a point where students are going to have to attend clinical placements. And in fact, I see somebody's asked the question about PPE for placements, that's personal protective equipment for placements. And that was certainly a concern in the early stage, that with the expected pandemic surge, that the students, as being sort of the least essential member of voluntary staff or honorary staff within a hospital, wouldn't have access to PPE. What's become very clear is that we would never put a student in a situation where they would need to wear PPE within a a virus ward or something like that. Now, it's difficult in general practices, for example. You really don't know who's going to walk through the door and whether they might have the virus. But there is a task force now active making sure that there is enough personal protective equipment for all health workers, and that if students are to be put in a situation where they would need to wear PPE, they've got adequate access to it and they know how to put it on, take it off safely.
Thank you, Steve. I think there's another question which I think for students who are almost reaching graduation, to talk about, what's the job market going to be, or, what happens if my statement is a part of my transcript has that this has been done online. Like, would you have some concern? I mean, I think we all have concerns about the job market, but, just some comments about what is the job market. Would there be any job market impact, or would you comment on the future of, I think you briefly touched it about the future of medical specialization, but I thought just to get some comments from you would be good.
Well, look, it's really interesting. The medicine's a little bit of a lucky profession, I guess, in that every graduate from the medical course who's an Australian, a CSP student is guaranteed an internship. Now, that does leave those who are fee paying in a second tier where they're not guaranteed, but we've had really good success in students getting internships, even if they're not CSP graduates. We're in a bit of a transitional stage for medicine, that what happens after that first year of internship is changing quite a bit. It used to be that you then went on and continued working in the hospitals and you got a specialist fellowship and then worked in a mixture of private and public practice and all those sorts of things. Now, that's changing quite a bit, I guess, as we go with alternative medical career paths. I find it fascinating that already I'm hearing from applicants to the medical course who want to come in next year that they're interested much more in public health and epidemiology and those sorts of things, because it's a little bit like when the CSI and NCIS and all those shows were so popular, everybody wanted to be a forensic pathologist. Now it looks like everybody wants to be an epidemiologist, which is absolutely fantastic, because that's actually a real strength of our course, in that we do want students to take a global view of health and not just the one-to-one, but a bit of both. So in fact, the job market looks fabulous. If anything, we have been given a lot of latitude, even to the point of being able to get students into the country because they're seen as being part of a COVID critical workforce. My heart goes out to those in other workforces where there's not the same focus, but okay, all the adulation for health workers that we see overseas with clapping and that sort of thing, I don't know that they're looking for that. I'm sure they're not. And certainly in this country, it hasn't been that sort of situation at all. But there is no question that health is very much on the front page, and particularly the leadership of chief nursing officer, chief medical officer, people like that, in basically making sure that the politicians are doing what's right for the community. It's been an incredible time for health as a profession, an occupation, to be in the forefront. So yeah, I think there's plenty of opportunity. It will mean that people going for jobs in the future will have on their transcripts or will have in their applications that they're were COVID affected, but because of what's been put in place to ensure outcomes, we know that that's not going to be a negative for graduates of the program. If anything, it'll be a positive.
I think, I think you quite clearly pointed out, I think out of this adversity, opportunities into the future may arise. And I guess particularly in the area of public health and medicine, I think as a country, we've really proven to be that the ability to rise to that occasion and for the community to feel safe and be provided the support, adequate support, has been, as just a common citizen, I think being very fortunate to be there. And I think that's something that we are very proud and privileged about. So I think in relation to that, just thinking about the future of medicine, I think you talked slightly about it, and you raised the concern that yes, there will be changes, but those changes will be also about teaching medicine post COVID-19. So, I know it's too early in the piece to think about it, but I'm sure at the University of Melbourne, those future ideas and plans may be already put in place.
Yes, and in fact, I think a lot of it's thinking about what the future of medicine is going to look like post-COVID. We won't go back to doing medicine the same sort of way. To be honest, it's sort of been a bit of a wake-up call that an awful lot of medical practice has been very doctor-centred rather than being patient-centred. I mean, the clinical work I do these days is in remote Aboriginal communities in Central Australia, and the logistics of moving doctors from Melbourne via Alice Springs to remote communities and back by flying doctor is enormously expensive, and it's not a good experience for people in those communities to have some bloke from Melbourne coming up every couple of months for a couple of weeks. It's really not the sort of health experience you would expect in Australia. So video consulting, telemedicine has taken off in leaps and bounds, and I really can imagine much more a future of medicine where consultations are occurring via the computer rather than necessarily face-to-face. Having said that there is a lot of medicine you still need to be face-to-face for, there's a lot that you don't be. But then again, for somebody to make the trip from Coburg to the Royal Melbourne for an outpatient appointment is a hassle. To be able to do that online is a lot more efficient for everybody. So our students are going to need a whole lot of new skill sets in handling telemedicine. They've taken to it like a duck to water again. And in fact, in some of our clinical schools, the more senior doctors have embraced having students around to help them with the technical aspects of telemedicine. Being digital natives, they're all over it. But yeah, the communication, I mean, I'm finding sitting here talking at a screen without being able to see you or the people I'm with not to be the sort of satisfying interactive experience you would generally have in this sort of chat. You don't get any feedback from the other person. But the reality is it's a very efficient way to communicate, and medicine's really all about communication.
As you were talking about communication, we have a question from our attendees. One was a question, I think, the exam monitor issue has been always of great concern. So there is a question is, what is the policy for if a student is unable to complete the exam? Say, if their computer or internet stops working or they need to go to the bathroom, what would be, I guess it's a practical question, but what would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, no, they're both very good questions from Natasha, because they've both been very live issues for us, which is very much an indication of it being a good question, because we've had to struggle with both these things. I mean, this is what the remote invigilation is all about, that the bot picks up if something happens which needs review, and we've got a pathway that's about to be communicated to students to show how this is triggered and then what happens. In the vast majority of cases, it is that, the cat jumps up on the desk or something like that, or, students scratching their ear with a pen or something of that sort of order, in which case the computer reports it, a human looks at it and says, that's definitely a cat, that's not somebody consulting, an online directory or whatever it might be. And so it goes no further. The toilet issue has been a problem, as have technical issues, and it's actually a pretty robust system, and there are various fail-safes built in, as I see it, in that the exam actually takes place offline. So if there is an internet interruption, it doesn't matter, it's only all uploaded afterwards, so you don't need a consistent connection during the 60 or 90-minute exam. So that deals with a whole lot of problems there that might happen because the NBN sucks, as we know. But the other thing is, if a student needs to go to the bathroom, we've seen instances of this where a student looks at the camera, looks stricken and says, I've got to go to the bathroom, and off they go and are back within 60 seconds, drying their hands on a towel. I mean, again, that's human nature, or it's biology, I guess. It's what happens. I had to deliver myself of the comment the other day, though, that, make sure you sit down at the computer with your brain full and your bladder and bowel empty, because that's really what we need. And most people can manage that pretty well. We have put in place allowances for students who need alternative exam arrangements, and a document's come out just in the past couple of days, which does allow for on-campus examinations for those who have special needs to have those. So, you know, we did in the early stage wonder about students with insufficient equipment and whether we'd have to bring them into the campus to make sure they had a reliable computer rather than an old Commodore 64 that would break down partway through. But again, the university has been very supportive and have actually found a whole lot of computers we've been able to loan to students to make sure that they've got reliable equipment. So that's been a good outcome as well. Big thing we talked about yesterday within the group to try and resolve is some students are living in environments where it's very hard to get privacy, and you need privacy for the exam, because if your little brother walks behind you, it shows up on the remote invigilation and it triggers an issue that needs to be investigated. Now, your little brother is probably not going to be helping you in the exam. I would have thought quite the opposite, but obviously it's a distraction. So being locked in a room on your own is appropriate. The other one's been to your earlier question about keeping up with clinical content. We have had remote clinical teaching where clinical cases and patients have been discussed online. And again, that's got to be done in private, because if you're sitting in the lounge room and your housemates are watching Netflix and you're sort of talking about patients, that's not appropriate. So some students have had to go to some lengths to get a private space for exams or clinical learning. But yeah, two good questions from Natasha there.
So the other question I think probably it's very important for us to talk about is, I think you've talked about it, is that, you know, students are definitely, I think it's not the medical school, all across graduate programs that we've been working on are very anxious. They have, over the last 12 to 13 weeks, actually been impacted by mental health issues and lots of other social issues. And I think some of the students have often, I mean, there's anxiety, but there's also the volume of work for faculty in relation to communication about how, you know, students can get accurate information or how they can seek clarification. Would you like to talk a little bit about what kind of support or additional support you're offering with students who have those special needs, or how they could, you know, get feedback about not only about issues, but if they have concerns about the quality of the course, how they can raise that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the one thing that does make students understandably very anxious is uncertainty. And, you know, we love to be really, really dogmatic about dates for assessments and what those assessments will be, and dates for return to placement and where those placements will be and things like that. What it has been, I guess, is a bit of a balancing act between being as clear and as certain on those things as we can without then getting locked into being unnecessarily restrictive with things evolving as quickly as they are. Like, for example, a couple of weeks ago, it looked like we were months away from return to clinical placements, but now with the few changes, things are starting to open up quite quickly. So we need to move promptly. We're also aware that some students have had to return interstate to family homes and things like that. We're going to need to get them back. So, you know, the time lag between a decision being made and it being communicated and also it being approved by the Central University has made things a bit less than ideal at times, I suppose. We've tried to give students an indication of course changes when they've been provisionally approved rather than having gone completely through the university's course change approvals processes, because that takes a long time. But then my big concern is having to wind it back and say, well, you know, we said we were going to make that change in order to sort of future-proof clinical placements over the next 6 months. We haven't been able to do that. So that's been a bit problematic. Our clinical school structure is meant to be where students can get the most appropriate information to their particular situation. Although we do try to get consistency across the clinical schools, some are having to do different things in order to make use of what capacity they have within their hospital to make sure that they're really getting best use of what clinical placements are available. So students should always talk directly to their clinical school to find out what the local situation is for them. Yeah, we do run webinars where we try to explain what's going on, but you know, they're a little bit fleeting. So the written information tends to be what students have to refer back to. And there've been quite substantial changes. I fully acknowledge that, in order to try to keep students progressing rather than running out of time.
Yeah, and any comment? So I think some students still, you know, have this concern, particularly in the MD area, about the conferences that were coming up in June. I know, you know, we can't predict anything, or at the moment, we're not in Victoria, not the area of commenting about how flexible the restrictions are, but any thought given to any online conferences for them to access?
Any online what, sorry?
The conferences that normally every year, I think a couple of students have talked about, you know, they do have a conference that they come across in the month of June, and, you know, has the school thought about offering on alternative online conferences?
Okay, I'm sorry, you're dropping in and out. Alternative online conferences, is it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay, one feature of the medical course is the student conference in the middle of the year, which is coming up in June, and that's a massive conference for all the students coming together. This year, we haven't been able to hold it face-to-face. So it's actually developed by a student organising committee who are absolutely extraordinary, and they've taken the bit between the teeth and are making a virtual conference for the students, which is actually looking really exciting. And I suspect it's going to be a significant change to the level of engagement students can have, because of the scalability of sessions and various things like that. We're no longer constrained by having to be face-to-face. Although, as with most conferences, some of the best time is spent in the coffee breaks and things like that, catching up with people you haven't seen for the year before. It also is where a number of topics are presented to students that don't fit as well within the sort of mainstream curriculum. So they're being delivered online as well, and students will be able to attend all those sessions online, as well as the students who are completing their research semester. They're the ones that the conference provides a platform for presenting their research in a 3-minute thesis and poster type format. So all that's continuing as well. The organising committee has just done the most extraordinary job of pulling all that together.
I may just ask, are there any questions from the attendees? I think, you know, Steve's given us a lot of his time, but if there are any questions, it may be a good time to ask them. But Steve, probably just a final comment. I think, you know, you heard it, and I think other people in the university have heard it. It's about the cost of the course. I think people have spoken about the cost of the course when it's delivered online compared to face-to-face. Any comments on that?
Well, yes, I think the Vice Chancellor made it very clear that, you know, the university, there's the question of the cost of the course and obviously its value, I suppose. One example is that the online proctoring system we put in place to keep students progressing cost $250,000. Now, that had to be approved overnight to make sure that we could continue to deliver the sort of reliable assessments. $250,000 doesn't just sit around, it has to be got from places. And, you know, one thing that the medical school is very much against is the laying off of staff, because the finances have dropped away. That just seems like a hell of a waste of good talent to put people off because we don't have income. That's the only way you can really save substantial money. But it's not something that we're prepared to do because we value staff and its contribution and their contribution. So, yeah, it's always interesting. People have been asking this question for 10 years. Why are university courses so expensive when you look at what the inputs to them are? I can't help but point to the smartphone in the student's hand. What's the actual cost of that piece of plastic? It's probably about $7. So why do we pay over $1,000 for it? It's obviously everything that goes into making it the smartphone. It is not the actual cost of the plastic and glass. So it's a rather convoluted way of dealing with an issue that's been around for 10 years. I've been involved. Yeah, the main thing is that, and to be honest, I see the questions come up. The big problem we've got is that the student conference is set as a subject, and as a subject, it therefore carries points within the 100 points per year. And the way the university does its invoicing, it invoices on the basis of subjects and their points value. So the student conference is always going to cost 6.25% of the whole year's cost or fee if it carries 6.25 points from the 100 points of the year. So, you know, we could easily roll that conference into one of the other subjects and then you wouldn't see a cost ascribed to it, but it's accounting, it's bookkeeping. Yeah. But it is a hell of a poke in the eye for the student when they receive an invoice for a conference which carries 6.25% of the load for the year and therefore carries 6.25% of the fee for the year, even though, you know, that's obviously not the cost.
I think we've all had this question, which you have already spoken about, you know, about the future of medical education, but what's the kind of support the government is offering the medical school, because public health and I think the field of medicine has now got its importance, which always it required. But I think, is there any further conversations with the Commonwealth government in relation to their investment in the future of medical education?
Well, again, I think I'm in a fairly lucky situation in that my colleagues and I are involved in producing a much needed resource for Australia, which are really well-trained doctors. What I do find a bit frustrating, I guess, is that, you know, my colleagues in clinical research who are busily developing a vaccine and various proven cures for the COVID-19 disease and other similar diseases, you know, the funding's under threat because of underinvestment in universities. So, you know, really, if it does come to staff reductions, does the university get rid of the researchers who are developing a vaccine or a cure for COVID-19? It's just absolutely ridiculous. On the medical education side of it, though, you know, I don't want to make out that we're a protected industry, but, you know, I do think we are in a good situation of having a very strong course producing really, really well-trained doctors, and there will always be a need for those. It's the same for any of the other health professions within the faculty. And in fact, I think what this might show, if we emerge from this pandemic with any sense, is that really well-trained and well-educated university graduates are what the country needs to get good leadership in a crisis, well-informed, science-based, evidence-based leadership.
Thank you so much, Professor Steve Trumble. You know, on behalf of the graduates of the University of Melbourne, and particularly from the medical school, the Council of GSA and the staff, thank you for your time. And I mean, I think your generosity of accepting the invitation within less than 5 minutes was fantastic. And this conversation has been so helpful because I think you coming on to a program of a small organization, talking to our students who are eagerly, sometimes quite anxious to the changes that have been in all across the environment, and to have the reassurance from you as the head of school that, you know, you are aware of the concerns, the steps that have been put in place, and the ongoing thinking that's going to be done to talk about the impact of COVID-19 beyond this period has been, I think, very well answered and responded to. So thank you once again. And on behalf of our community, we'd like to thank the medical profession. And, you know, we're very fortunate to have the support that we've always had from our doctors and nurses and from the medical profession. And thank you for providing that support to the future of medicine in Australia.
Thank you for the opportunity, Rakna, but please make sure the thanks are given to the statisticians and the bioepidemiologists who have basically tracked the course of this. It's been remarkable.
That's definitely true. Thank you so much, Steve. So well, to the attendees, thank you so much for attending today's sessions, and for the other, thank you to the student engagement team to put this session on. I guess that it's really important that everybody across the university as well as around our community are trying their very best to address the concerns. Obviously, all of us are not going to be happy at all situations, but I think having the dialogue, having the communication, being prepared to hear what can be done and to wait for what can be done into the future is often testing and trialing for many of us. But I guess I continue to say the same message is we are in it together, we're here to support one another, and the important message that I'd like you to kind of hold on to is that be safe and be able to contribute to the community in the way that you can by ensuring that we maintain the restrictions and follow the rules to keep our community safe and ensure you seek out help. So a big thank you too to the representation team who put all the information for me together today to talk to Steve, Professor Steve Trumble today. So we look forward to meeting you next Thursday with another expert on board. So goodbye from now, and thank you very much.
Thank you.